Hello and welcome to episode 15 of OPERAVISION's Next Generation series. I'm Nina Brazier, a stage director based in Frankfurt, and over this series we've been diving into 4 European young artist programmes, exploring how the opera world is developing and nurturing the next generation of talent. In this episode, we're looking at how voices in the opera world are calling for change to make it better for all our young artists. Opera has long been accused of elitism, racism and misogyny, and over the course of the next few episodes, we'll be investigating the lived experience of artists who are actively striving to make the opera world a place where everyone feels welcome. Opera can no longer ignore its race problem, wrote Joshua Barone in the New York Times in 2020, one of many articles in recent years to report on the subject. We're going to begin by looking at the representation of Asian culture on the operatic stage. I've invited 3 contributors, 2 from the USA and 1 from Germany, and each are addressing the question of representation within a particular local context. In this episode, we explore why cancelling the work we love is not the answer, how trying not to offend can backfire, and how live opera is like eating a meal in a restaurant. As always, let's hear some opening words from our guests.
Asian women are often portrayed as naive, submissive, cute, and conservative in a way, but also at the same time very kinky and dirty in private, so that's a cliche.
As the larger calls for diversity were happening, we want non-white people, non-Europeans to come into this art form and fit in and feel included and seen. Yet here's caricatured, outdated versions of your heritage, and that we're just refusing to change because it's, quote, tradition.
When I first started my career, I remember makeup artists used to say to me, well, let's figure out how we can make you look more Asian.
Nina Yoshida Nelson is an artistic associate at Boston Lyric Opera, where she recently worked as dramaturg on Madama Butterfly, directed by Phil Chan. She's also the founder of the Asian Opera Alliance. I asked her what she's working on at the moment.
I am in Seattle, Washington, where I'm working with Seattle Opera on the opera Alcina, and I'm actually singing what is normally the bass role of Melisso. They've turned it back to the original poem in which she is Melissa. And so I'm singing a bass role here.
Now, you are known first and foremost as a busy working mezzo-soprano, but also in 2021, you founded the Asian Opera Alliance. Was there a catalyst or a turning point for this where you thought something just has to change in the industry?
Yeah, there actually was. In spring of 2021, we experienced in the United States some mass shooting of Asian women in Atlanta. And this was soon after George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. And we saw a huge uptick in violence against Asians in the midst of COVID. So after the shooting, we started to see opera companies posting on social media, we support our Asian artists. And because I have worked at a lot of these companies, I was often tagged in these posts. And I was tagged in one post where I went and looked at it, and I noticed that they had tagged the wrong Asian soprano. And I was like, oh my gosh, it is something that we experience a lot actually as Asians is the stereotype of, oh, all Asians look the same. But as I was looking at this post, I was like, oh, every single person in these photos are Asians that have been pigeonholed into stereotypically Asian roles. So you had an Asian person singing Madama Butterfly, somebody in Turandot, and then, other operas like that. And I called up my friend and I said, well, the next step for Asians in the industry is to not be typecast into solely Asian roles. And she asked me, well, Nina, in a typical season, how many non-Asian roles do you sing? And I went back and I started counting. And it turned out that it wasn't how many non-Asian roles in a season I sing, but it was how many non-Asian roles in 10 seasons I had sung. And in 10 seasons, I had sung 150 Madama Butterflies, American Dream, which is another Asian American opera, a bunch of contemporary Asian American opera stories. And in 10 years, I had sung 3 non-Asian roles.
Wow.
I was shocked. And so my friend said, well, Nina, it's time to start speaking out. You're one of the oldest Asian American singers out there. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not that old, but it's true. I am one of the oldest. Yeah. She said, and so you have this responsibility to start speaking out. And I was like, oh, I don't know. I'm not sure that I can. I'm scared that, I'll be labeled as a troublemaker and people won't want to work with me anymore. And we really talked about how to advocate as a working singer and what it's like to be used as a resource in our industry.
Phil Chan is an arts administrator, director and educator who founded Final Bow for Yellowface with the ballerina Gina Pashkokin with the commitment to eliminate what he considers as outdated and offensive stereotypes of Asians, Yellowface, on our stages. His books, Final Bow for Yellowface and Banishing Orientalism, are essential reading. Phil and I caught up from his home in Brooklyn and mine in Frankfurt. I asked if there was an event or catalyst for his initial activism.
So I'm a big ballet nerd, and there was a production of Alexei Ratmansky's Sleeping Beauty, and it was a big co-production, huge sets and costumes based on the Diaghilev Sleeping Princess version from the turn of the 20th century. And so we're getting to the third act, and there's this, these sort of porcelain people who come out, and it's, white dancers in yellowface dressed as like porcelain people, like a man and 2 women sort of bobble out, and then they sort of bobble away. And they're like, there wasn't a dance. They were just sort of decoration. And it just felt like, oh, that's kind of gross. And I realized just, as the larger calls for diversity were happening, people saying, yes, diversity, equity, inclusion, we want non-white people, non-Europeans to come into this art form and fit in and feel included and seen. Yet here's caricatured, outdated versions of your heritage, and that we're just refusing to change because it's, quote, tradition. So what does that look like then, from a constructive standpoint? So we can't cancel our heritage, but we also can't keep doing it the way it has been going. And so finding ways to, I guess, change, because our art form has changed since it started. We no longer do things the way we did them 50 years ago, 100 years ago. Training is different. Technology is different. Society is different. So if we're okay with some changes, why are we not okay with others?
Let's get back to Nina, whose initial fears over challenging stereotypes were allayed with help from her friend.
We came up with what ended up being a social media post, just talking about my experiences. And in this post, I really did say stuff like, I'm scared to be doing this. And at the time, our industry was still not back to work because of COVID. And so I wrote about how I was afraid that when we did finally come back, that there would be no place for me anymore. And it was honest and raw, and people really responded to it.
Aileen Schneider is a staff director here at Oper Frankfurt and a successful poetry slam artist, the Meisterin of our state of Hessen. We met between rehearsals. She's reviving Fedora and I'm in the middle of cast changes for Figaro. When was the first time Asian representation in opera was something that she became aware of?
Growing up in a very small town southwest of Germany, there was not much representation of people of color in general or Asian people in general. So I think my first realization of how international opera can be was in university. I grew up being read as Asian or at least mixed race, and therefore a lot of cliches going on with it, like being especially good and ambitious in school and musical education, because I was forced by my parents or predestined by my culture to achieve as much as possible, but none of that was actually the case. In one of my first opera productions I ever took part in was Philip Glass' The Sound of a Voice, as an intern, actually, some years ago. So the story plays in ancient Japan, where a samurai warrior inquires a woman who allegedly lures men into their death by witchcraft. And it was performed by an all-white German cast. And although we talked a lot about how to respectfully portray Japanese culture, it still felt a bit naive putting them in kimonos and letting them handle katanas, which are Japanese swords, of course. In my audition for my studies of opera stage direction, I was asked how The Sound of a Voice was different to, for example, Madama Butterfly in terms of representation. And I answered that the conflict in Madama Butterfly is more archaic and generally valid because it's about two strange worlds colliding, which could also well be classism or any kind of post-colonialism, and therefore doesn't really need exitism, whereas The Sound of a Voice had a very specific form and enigma to it, using traditional Japanese instruments so that the cultural mysticism had to take a hold at least somewhere in the staging as well. So that, I think, was my first realization of how different and how differentiated Asian representation in music theater is.
Back in Seattle with Nina Yoshida Nelson. On your journey as a singer along the way, was there a time where you realized you perhaps weren't necessarily being seen for roles you felt would really suit you?
Yeah, I think that as singers, we're just trying to get hired. So any job that comes our way, yes, yeah, let me do this. Yeah, absolutely. I'll take this, I'll take that. But I remember when I was a student at the Academy of Vocal Arts in Philadelphia, we were working on Suzuki, and my coach, right towards the end of my studies there, my coach, she was like, "Are you sure that you want to go down this path? Once you go down, it'll be all you sing." And I was like, "No, it won't be all I sing," because it wasn't that I ever really identified as Asian or Asian American. I was Californian. I'm fourth generation. And so by the time, it got to me, a lot of the Asian culture had been left behind for quite a few years. And I always say that it actually wasn't until I started being typecast into all these roles that I had to actually figure out what it meant to be Asian or Asian American or Japanese American, because it was a part of my identity that I hadn't really come to terms with.
And where you are right now, are you in a position where you'd think, actually, I would say no to Suzuki's in order to expand my repertoire elsewhere? Or is it something that you will possibly always come back to?
That's a great question. I've done several Suzuki's now post-pandemic. And as an advocate, knowing what's happening behind the scenes, knowing what I'm advocating for, singing Suzuki now is not as easy as it was for me pre-pandemic, when I think, my eyes were also covered and I wasn't really in tune with what it meant to be an advocate. That being said, it's also our foot in the door. And so something that I tell a lot of young Asian American Asian singers is, if you are going and singing a role like Butterfly or Suzuki or Ping Pang Pong, whatever that might be for you, make sure that you're advocating for yourself and saying, or that your agent is advocating for you and saying, "This is great, I will take this opportunity, but what else will you also give me that is not based on my ethnic identity? Don't only see me as this."
There's a moment in Phil Chan's book, Final Bow for Yellowface, when he says, "Don't be the Asian person brought in to justify doing something racist." As a consultant, has he ever felt trapped in that situation where he's been brought in to rubber stamp something that isn't going in the direction he would want?
I think early in my career, you don't really have a choice. You want to do better. You want to help these organizations. You want to help them get it. You want to help get it right. Also, if you don't do it, no one else will. There's not that many people who are able to have this conversation. So I have the privilege of being able to say no now when I can see that that's the dynamic. In recent years, I have said no to directing other productions of Butterfly, for example, which they just wanted me to restage their version with the sets and costumes they already had. But if with my name on it, then they could absolve themselves of any responsibility of actually having to own the creative decisions of the production that they've have in their warehouse for 50 years and weren't willing to change. So when BLO came and was like, hey, well, like, what would you do with Butterfly? Like really reimagining from scratch. Like that was a much more interesting challenge. I think as BIPOC folks, we would go into these spaces and there's just been so many times where we have been the sort of Asian shield or the Black shield or whatever, and to not be able to actually use your voice and to make it about what your ideas are. And this has been a very different process. It's been great. I've been able to assemble my own team, primarily folks of Japanese American heritage whose families were impacted by what was happening in the 40s, but also Asian American women who still have to deal with what being an Asian woman means and what's in the water culturally around that. So part of my work with writing this book is to also say, like, it's not just folks of a specific heritage that can deal with those problems. The reimagining can happen across the board. So if there's something that's old and dusty from Europe that inspires you, but it has to take place in Africa or Asia or wherever, you try to do something new with that. And that's great.
How has Aileen Schneider's awareness of Asian representation and appropriation changed over time?
It changed in a way that I learned to differentiate more between reproducing cliches and stereotypes on one hand, and on the other hand, appreciating and welcoming other cultures into the still seemingly very elitist and exclusive context of traditional opera. So I think you have to ask yourself, do we really need kimonos to tell the story? Or can it be about human, like very basic human values and stories? And I'm also glad to hear more and more people of color speak up about their experiences of discrimination and typecasting so that I can learn more and more about their realities.
Chan has created a cultural integrity grid to help companies move towards more three-dimensional and realistic characters and shift work from something that could be cancelled into something that we can keep in our repertoire.
The sort of cultural integrity grid, it's basically 4 quadrants. And on one axis, you have outsider fantasy versus an insider fantasy. So whose gaze is it? And then on the other axis, you have character and caricature. So when we're looking at a work like The Mikado, it is a work that's an outsider's fantasy of Japan, and it's highly caricatured. So then that's where you put it on the map. You put it in a particular quadrant. So how do we solve the problems that we have of majority white, usually in yellow face? How do we swing that to give the work more integrity? So how do you turn it then from an outsider's fantasy into an insider's fantasy? And so that's what the creative shift could be to keep the Mikado so you don't have to cancel the work. So this is really a framework to avoid canceling some of the problematic issues or salvaging individual characters or individual songs or reimagining them for a larger multiracial global audience.
Back to early morning in Seattle, I asked Nina if she's ever been directed to present caricatured roles.
I wouldn't say caricature because I always try to bring honesty and truth to Suzuki as a character. But I don't walk around in my own personal life and bow and shuffle. And I think things have gotten quite a bit better. But I was in butterfly rehearsals not too long ago where the chorus was given their shoes on the first day of rehearsal, their little Japanese shoes. And first thing they did before there was any instruction or conversation was they were walking around, shuffling their feet, bowing really quickly. And I was like, oh, okay, now I know that we need to make sure that what we're doing is that we're having these conversations with chorus before we even give them that opportunity to do stuff like that. And there was another place that I was that the chorus decided they were going to do their own makeup, and they came out very much in yellow face. And so a lot of that comes with education. It's about speaking up, and it's about knowing how to speak up. It shouldn't be only the Asian people who are speaking up, but as non-Asians, how can you be an ally and not leave it only to us to be our responsibility to talk about?
As Phil points out in Final Bow for Yellowface, often, and indeed probably always, the intention behind productions is not to offend. How do people with good intentions sometimes get it wrong?
I actually get more of a sense that people are not trying because they're afraid to fail. I think there's a fear of saying the wrong thing, so I'd rather not have the conversation. There's a fear that I'll put something on stage that will get me canceled, so I'd rather make something safe. And that's not going to get audiences back at a time when we need to be taking artistic risks. We need to be bold. We need to be colorful and imaginative. And if you're afraid of insulting people, if you're walking on eggshells, if you are making creative decisions based on fear, what audience is going to take pleasure from that? That we are now a multiracial global art form. That means collaboration. That means extra research. That means maybe saying, you know what, I'm not the best person for this project, and stepping aside and giving opportunities to other people. It means working with someone that you might not have ever thought would be your kind of person, who would get your kind of project, who you could work with. And that's what being creative is, even though it's scary.
What's Eileen's take?
As an intersectional feminist myself, I think the thing I'm aware of the most is the post-colonialism discourse in terms of representing Asian women in media. Asian women are often portrayed as naive, submissive, cute, and conservative in a way, but also at the same time very kinky and dirty in private, so that's a cliche. And that makes them very attractive to the male gaze, which is still the dominant perspective on narratives in recent pop culture. So Madama Butterfly can be a very symptomatic depiction of that problem, because I've seen her very childlike and passionate, which makes her sacrifice in the end even more tragic. And of course, she's supposed to be very young, but it also takes a lot of guts to renounce your family and culture to begin a new life with a stranger. So I think she's stronger than all the other characters, but at the same time fails to be a good mother. And this could make her very complex and fleshed out. But mostly she's just a beautiful trophy who bows to Pinkerton's every will and conveniently kills herself in the end, so the audience can feel the catharsis and not worry about an ongoing struggle of having lost a child and all life perspective.
Coming up, I mention AAPI, standing for people of Asian, Asian American, and Pacific Islander descent. For non-AAPI people such as myself, what do you think is important for us to recognize about the impact of the symbols and archetypes we see represented on the stage? Because if I was playing devil's advocate, why are these stereotypes problematic if we can recognize that they are just these stereotypes presented?
The most important thing is to listen and give room for sharing thoughts and experiences on the subject with people who are concerned, because we should not gatekeep these platforms from the people who are actually concerned by the problematic depiction of their culture. We have to know that they probably have a different past and reality as we do, so we can learn. Because I once heard a woman say, "When you meet me, forget that I'm Black, but at the same time, never forget that I'm Black," which means never forget history, but also don't keep reproducing it by putting cliches on me.
What do you think are the ways we can and should approach bringing these sort of, let's say, problematic, inverted commas, operas to the stage without appropriation? Is it, you were mentioning before, these well fleshed out characters? Does it go back to character? Does it go back to interpretation? Where do we begin?
I mean, in general, I don't think there are many inherently problematic pieces in the repertoire. Of course, if they include racism or sexism as an important plot device, we should ban them from being played. But this process, I think, is already in motion. But our modern responsibility is doing operas like Butterfly or even Zauberflöte. It's very important to remember that we don't live in that past where it was written, and that there's no use for representing the past. We need to find the points in the narrative which are still relatable and try to highlight them. And Butterfly is not a documentation about past Japan. It is a fantasy. And Zauberflöte doesn't need a Black villain to tell the story in a captivating way. So our society grows, and so should our takes on opera subjects.
It's an issue that Nina is tackling head on. The Asian Opera Alliance sent out a letter in 2021 to every general director of opera companies in the US. One thing that really struck me were the 4 bullet points calling for opera companies to cast us, include us, pursue us, and consult us. But I'm curious to hear how the response was to the letter and whether it's become part of a bigger conversation.
It was definitely a mixed response. We had people who reached out to us right away and said, "Welcome to the industry. We're happy to have you here." We had the majority of general directors did not respond at all to our letter, which also was very telling and very interesting. I think that there were people who were worried that we were going to come in and try and cancel them. In some ways, we live in a very binary society, a very black and white society. And oftentimes the Asian voice is left out of the mix. But I think most importantly, we were brought into the conversation. So that was a great first step. But unless you're poking at the system all the time, the system is built to reset itself.
Since 2017, almost every major American ballet company has signed the Final Bow for Yellowface pledge to eliminate outdated and offensive stereotypes of Asians from our stages. Phil has received a swathe of positive responses from people across the performing arts industry. But he's also been honest about negative voices in the conversation. What can we say to people that feel like certain performances should be preserved as they were originally presented?
I like to think of the static art forms like paintings, sculpture, film, photography, and then the performing arts, which are live, live symphony performances, operas, plays, theaters, ballets, operas, etc. Things you see in a theater. Those are 2 very different types of art. One is static and one is sort of performing, organic. I'm in Brooklyn, New York right now, and there's the Brooklyn Botanical Garden right next to the Brooklyn Museum. The curator at the Brooklyn Museum has to make sure that the paintings are preserved, that the light humidity, temperature is really regulated. People aren't touching it. The botanic gardens next door was to make sure that the plants have light and pollinators and dirt and messy and water. And it's a very different way of creating beauty. And performances have always changed. If you've ever seen a Shakespeare play with a woman in it, you're already seeing something that is non-traditional. Our art forms are changing all the time. And it's, in fact, in that change that it's sort of like we're able to keep the mirror looking like us, because that's what the arts have to do, right? You know, you get to eat what was there at the restaurant at that meal. And then once the meal's over, that's it. Like, I'm sorry that you can't go back and eat that same bowl of spaghetti that was so delicious. Like, I don't know what to tell you. That's not how we experience this art form, right?
Back to Aileen. Now, I'm thinking about our stages here in Germany. Now, we do have a certain amount of representation when it comes to AAPI. And I'm wondering, what do you think we can and should do to improve it further?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is perhaps the Frauenquote here in Germany, which is a set percentage of women who are in leading positions. And it exists to help and find a balance, finally, after hundreds of years of repressing and marginalizing certain voices. And I think we could achieve that also in ethnic representation and also education, which means that we should try to find more diversity in casting, be more open to different phenotypes, different looks, and also be open to different voices in telling the stories that we think we know, but when other people who did not grow up with that look onto them, perhaps we can learn something new about it.
Meanwhile, Nina and her colleagues at the Asian Opera Alliance have come up with a very clear way to reflect what's happening in season announcements and on stages across the United States. And it all comes down to numbers.
About 2.5 years ago, AOA started creating pie charts for season announcements because, you know, we talked about it a lot, and it's not just about who you cast, but it's also about who gets that press for those season announcements. Those pie charts are the brainchild of our AOA's vice president, Nicholas Pon. He's a fabulous tenor. And he really brought it to our attention that in order to really have honest discussions about diversity and equity and inclusion, we had to have numbers. And until we have numbers, we have no way to measure where we are, where we've come from, and where we're going. So if you're cast in something, say I'm cast in an opera, yet my face and my name is not in that season announcement, I'm invisible. right? And so it's important that to bring awareness to all of the aspects of casting and announcing and press. And so we just thought, well, what better way than to just show the numbers? This is your season, and this is what you announced, even though it may not be as diverse as your season actually ends up being as far as casting goes. This is what it looks like. These are the people that are getting that press. And it's been really fascinating also to see how people react to these mirrors that are being held up to them, because there's a lot of defensiveness and a lot of, well, this isn't the way our full season is going to end up, and we know that, and we say that in our posts, but we also say that it's important that we acknowledge that this is what it looks like.
I watched Nina's documentary on Time magazine online, where she says, "As an Asian singer, there have not been tons of people who have come before me. This industry was not created for me." I wondered, what should non-Asians in the opera community do to help nurture the next generation of Asian talent and to make sure they're genuinely included?
Most importantly, for us as Asian singers, inclusion. How can you include us in the conversation? And there are things that we do within Asian Opera Alliance also to make sure that our Asian creatives in the industry are getting professional development courses. We offer, that are taught for our members, by our members for free. We offer peer mentorship. We're really trying to mentor that next generation of singers. We're taught about, singing technique, diction, acting, stuff like that, but we're not taught a whole lot about other aspects of our industry. So how can I, as someone who has been in the industry for quite a while now, make sure that the next generation coming in is more well equipped to know more about the industry than I was, so that they can also contribute to the best of their abilities? As far as allies go, I think people are often scared and don't know how to be an ally. But for example, this was a fabulous example. Recently, I was in a meeting and I was having a side conversation with someone else who was in the meeting. And I said to this person, I really feel like we need to acknowledge the fact that hiring another white person is only adding to white supremacy. And this was a white colleague of mine. And they said, well, it shouldn't be just your responsibility to bring that up in this room. What if I were to bring it up? How can I do that? And I was like, sure, go for it. And so I let this person bring up this idea that it didn't always have to be white people that we're bringing in and hiring. And when they said this in this meeting, I kind of just took a huge breath and I was like, oh my gosh, that was incredible to hear someone else besides me saying that. And this person said to me, it shouldn't always be your responsibility, Nina. It shouldn't always be on your back to bring up subjects like that. I can help as well. And I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner, but I'm here to help and to be part of that change. It's okay to speak up and to learn how to advocate for people who have been traditionally marginalized. Even if you are in the majority, it doesn't mean there's going to be less for you. It just means that there's going to be, more for all of us, I think, in the long run. Normally, when I do say things like that in meetings, my adrenaline is pumping pretty high, because it's scary every time I say something to be the one who's saying that stuff, thinking, oh my gosh, will this be the time that I'm not rehired because, am I pushing the boundaries too far?
Have you at any point felt like, oh, I've overstepped the mark and, oh, that contact's gone, or that's a company I can't pursue for a while, or has it always felt like it's been a positive change for you?
I'm not sure, because here we are 2.5 years into my advocating. And as opera singers, There's a cycle of how often we're hired at opera companies. So as a singer, I'm not sure. We'll see if I get rehired by some of these companies where I have been pushing the boundaries more than I would have pre-pandemic. I'm already a pretty cautious person. Advocating is not something that comes naturally to me. Before starting the Asian Opera Alliance, I don't know that I had ever spoken up about anything really in my life. And I'm constantly learning about what works and what doesn't work and why and how it may work for me, but maybe not for somebody else. I think that's something also that's often left out of the conversation, is that we are all, even though we're all, lumped into one specific group, there are a lot of differences within this identity of Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, East Asian, and then born in the United States or born elsewhere and immigrated to the United States, growing up as a majority in Asia and then coming and learning what it's like to be a minority. Some of the intricacies of what that identity is are left out of the picture. And so really leaving room for that in the conversation is important as well.
I asked Phil, what about when people go too far in the other direction and make productions too safe?
Sometimes if you don't do enough because you're scared, it just becomes nothing. It's like a throwaway, or it's a missed opportunity. And when you really are open and can be creative and go there because you're not afraid of offending somebody, I think that's when you have interesting art. It's not about not offending people or being politically correct. It's about making good art for everybody.
Finally, I asked Aileen, how do you think we can make the world a better place for our AAPI allies?
Listening, respecting boundaries, give room for learning new things, and also be open to unlearn what we thought we know and what we thought was a given, and also be interested in what unites us rather than divides us.
Thank you so much to Nina Yoshida Nelson, Aileen Schneider and Phil Chan for joining me today for this episode, and thanks to you for listening. There's plenty more online at operavision.eu, where you can see From Studio to Stage, a documentary with young artists at Opera Frankfurt, the Opera for Peace masterclasses with Aileen Perez and Brian Jade in Paris, Il Viaggio a Reims from the Accademia Rossiniana's Alberto Zedda, and Nombulelo Yende in the final of BBC Cardiff Singer of the World. I'll link to those in the show notes and give details on all the other music extracts you heard in this episode. This series is edited and produced by Karen Piri and curated and hosted by me, Nina Brazier. OperaVision is co-funded by the European Commission.